Okay, so we're talking about a passage from the lectionary for the fourth Sunday after Pentecost in year C. It's the first section of chapter 10 of the Gospel of Luke, and it's commonly referred to as the sending of the 70 or the 72, generally understood to be talking about mission work. Uh, Jesus sends people out to the countryside. Um, and we're going to ask some questions about this section as to whether it really means what we think it does. There's a couple of things that people generally remember about this passage, that they're missionaries being sent, that they're sent with very few possessions, like, and that they get a little bit ranty at the end, and they can dust off their sandals if a village rejects. And that's pretty much what people remember about this. Uh, it also is followed right after by the story that was oftentimes referred to as the parable of the Good Samaritan. It's unique to Luke. Also, this story about the sending of the 70, it's unique to Luke as well, even though it draws from some narrative traditions that are also found in Mark and Matthew about the sending of the 12. The language is very similar, but the details are very different. Um, Altogether, we're going to look at the Good Samaritan parable very briefly to try to figure out how that informs this other section that it's right next to and see if there's any connections there. And then learn some things. Great. So let's start. So first off, the question of why is there no ac like account of mission work before this time? Like mission work seems to be all of a sudden it comes up in the Christian scriptures, but is not seen at all in the Hebrew scriptures. There is no really well documented account of conversion at all, it turns out, in the Hebrew scriptures. Some people might point out to a story like Ruth, where Ruth says, something really, really beautiful, like "Your people shall be my people, and your God shall be my God," and as a story of conversion, but it really isn't because Ruth is still referred to afterwards as Ruth the Moabite. And at this point in time, the reason for this lack of mission understanding in the Hebrew scriptures is because when we look at this map, we see that Israel is surrounded by other cultures, kingdoms, that each have their own god, whether it be Milcom or Chemosh or Baal. Um, and the whole story that's told in the Hebrew scriptures is not one about there being only one God and other people, the right thing to do would be that if the whole world worshiped our one God because there is only one God. It's actually a story of there being many gods in the world and each kingdom, each people, each culture being called to a call of loyalty to the one God that they're supposed to worship. So it's not monotheism, in which there only is one God and everyone is just worshiping a stick figure or an image. It's called monolatry, where each there are multiple gods, but you are called to worship just one of them. Only one God is the right God for you. In fact, there are several biblical prohibitions against intermarriage, crossing cultures, because of the fear that introducing or mix with the other religious traditions that are surrounding Israel would lead to a dilution or lead to people like leaving the right path of worshiping Yahweh. So, so not only does mission not exist because you're not trying to convert anyone to your God. You're supposed to worship your God and they're supposed to worship their God, but in fact, it's prohibited. Um, we know that there are stories of conversion in the later Second Temple period after the Hebrew scriptures kind of leave off in their historical time. Um, and I guess that has to be correctly understood as the process of cultural assimilation, that there might have been an intermarriage, but that doesn't mean immediately that someone is converted to the faith of the God of Israel, but only throughout multiple generations later, as people really become enmeshed in the culture of Israel, do they then take on the God of Israel as well, and do they follow the laws and practices? In fact, people are referred to, there are two categories. There are Jews in Israel, and there are neighbor strangers, or something about like a permanent resident who's always still foreign. And that's the way that Israel understands these other people. They're not expected to take on this religion. They might um, still obey the same prohibitions, but they're not necessarily uh, uh, like prohibitions against um, eating blood, for example. But they're not required to take on the positive um, obligations of Judaism, like circumcision or observance of the festivals. Um, so there really is no awareness, no need, no desire for people to convert. So that's why there's no mission work. So that's the context that we're coming out of, that a long tradition of there just being silence on the subject. And then maybe in the couple of centuries before uh, Jesus's time, there being some awareness because of the mixing of cultures that it is possible for people to change their religion to become part of Israel, but that is not an overnight process. It doesn't involve just a change of heart. That is nothing short of like marrying into multiple generations and having your children slowly become and your generations of children slowly become Jewish. That's how it's understood. Okay, so I mentioned the Good Samaritan. We're going to start here first, even though it comes second in the text, and we're just going to use it as a brief starting point to ask ourselves some questions about how does this talk about the ideas of neighbor and stranger, and how are we supposed to love people that are different than us? Okay, so the traditional understanding of this is that there's the one victim and there are three characters, and it's a moral tale. Who are you supposed to be like? And we're, of course, supposed to be like the person who is um, the one who showed compassion, the Samaritan. And don't be like the other two because they ignored the suffering of a stranger, of someone they didn't know, a stranger. So in that reading, the point that this person is a Samaritan is sort of lost. Um, and that's important that this person, the character who does the compassionate work, is really different. Not just different culturally, but different in religion as well. Even though Samaritans and Jews came from a common heritage, by this point in time, they understood each other to be practicing a different religion. So that's going to be important here. Also, notice that there's another character, and I think this is actually the person that we're supposed to identify with, if the point of the story is, in fact, to identify with anyone. It's not identifying with the Samaritan and being, a good neighbor. The point of this is actually to identify with the expert on the law right in the beginning in chapter 25, who's asking the question that actually is more familiar to us. We don't oftentimes have the opportunity to save a life. Although, I mean, if we're given that opportunity, of course, we should do the right thing. But I think it's probably actually my daily lived experience that I'm asking the same question that the expert in the law asks, which is basically, how little do I have to do? Um, what is the minimum that I'm expected to do to be a moral person? And that's what he's asking in the question of who is my neighbor and who is the stranger, because there are laws in Leviticus about loving your neighbor. And so the question then moves on to, well, if I know that I have to love my neighbor, that's not in dispute. Who does this count towards, or who am I required to love? Um, and that's what he's doing when he's quoting loving your neighbor as yourself. Um, these are a bunch of different actually laws that go all the way back to Leviticus. This is not some like Christian concept. This is the adoption of a much older Jewish tradition, which required um, loving neighbor. Okay, so the question is asked to Jesus, who is my neighbor? Who is my stranger? And that's a question I think we all are actually asking ourselves, especially now today. Um, who is it that we're required to take care of? I mean, I think then the fact that in this country we're answering that question differently between people that are very, very upset about um, migrants here who are undocumented and people who are very upset that we would be inhospitable to migrants here who are undocumented means that we are still asking this question about who is my neighbor and who is the stranger. Um, that's the question, but the answer doesn't match. Jesus's answer is completely as if someone had asked a completely different question. The question is, who is my neighbor? Who's my stranger? And Jesus' answer is the quality of what makes someone a neighbor. This is in verse 37. Uh, and this is given through the words of the expert law, um, but conditioned by the stories to elicit this response. The one who gave compassion, the one who showed compassion. Um, this is how one acts as a neighbor. So even though the question was who is one of identity, how do I divide people? Jesus' response is how does one be? How does one behave as a result? And it's a question of grace and love, of course. Um, okay, So how does this apply? Until the later half of the 20th century, let's be honest. Christians did not interpret this as being a sense of universal love. We were good at showing love to people that we considered to be very much like us. And if you weren't like us, if you didn't believe the same things, if you didn't read the same Bible or the same sacred texts, we had another thing that we did to you, and that was we converted you. So the way that we showed love to people who were different, the stranger, was through the process of mission and conversion. We turned the stranger into the neighbor, and then we loved them only to the extent that they agreed to be like us, to believe the things that we did. It's really a pretty modern idea that we could love people in their difference. And certainly it's not something that Christianity practiced very for a very long historic period. Um, the problem is that when we love people through the act of conversion, we're essentially erasing the need for a distinction between neighbor and stranger, but not by saying they're equally the same. We're saying that the stranger is just a neighbor I haven't made into a neighbor yet, um, and that's problematic because loving people who worship differently than us means that we should love them as they are, not in their differentness, not only to the extent that they agree to do the things that we think they should do or to be more like us. That's a really a colonizing mindset, right? That the whole world is out there to become more like me, that my experience of religion, that my experience of truth is centered, is the only right thing, and that everyone who disagrees just hasn't gotten it right yet. Um, and the fundamental lesson is here that the categories in this story, that the categories of stranger and neighbor are real and distinct. The problem that the way that we've worked this out in our longer history of Christian missions is that we treated those categories as being one is just a potential for the other. Strangers are just future neighbors. Um, and we showed compassion to them only through that conversion process, or like that was our way of loving people. So let's remember again that the Samaritan is a different religion, not a Gentile, but still would have been considered an Israelite, but not Jewish. And in this story, um, people who believe different things act with compassion, even if they don't share a common belief system. Um, and that's going to be important for us for in terms of our humility. Uh, if we look at who the neighbor is, like we put on our text scholar hats, we would see that the neighbor actually exists in both positions. So in verse 27, the neighbor is the recipient. Uh, oh, sorry. Yeah, in the neighbor uh, is the object of compassion in verse 27, but in verse 36, the neighbor is the origin of compassion. So neighbors are both in this story taking both roles, and it's really kind of giving dignity um, to and reminding us that neighbors are not necessarily just the people that have a lot to give, um, that they are also receivers as well. And that's important for us when we think about mission, because when we do things for each other, when we take care of each other, when we see another person in need, the truth is that we're bound to them in a relationship. Um, and what we're actually seeing here is not that we should have neighbors, but that we should make ourselves close to each other. So this is an act of, again, just like Jesus is saying that we're, the question might be, who is my neighbor? But the answer is one of how does one be a neighborhood? The call here is not to recognize necessarily the categories only. The answer here, the point is the behaviors that we are that this kind of question engenders. Um, and I think that it's an important thing for us to remember because seeing the fact that neighbor can be on either side, both the giver and the receiver here in this story, um, kind of helps us to negate the idea of needy people in this world. That when we objectify other people as needing us, especially when missionaries come in with the idea that we have a lot to give, culture, development, knowledge of a particular religion, and other people are willing, you know, um, objects, that they are the people who need development, who need uh, religion, who need Christianity. We create this divide between the haves and the have-nots. And here in this story, there isn't quite that clear divide. In fact, it's really muddying that. And we see that the directions of giving, the directions of neighborliness go in both directions. So it's really much more of a relationship of mutuality here than it is of division. And these are the lessons I think that we need to take and apply back to the first section. So we're going to remember the idea that it's challenging that this story, the Good Samaritan, as it speaks to the mission of sending, that it challenges the idea of a divide between the haves and the have-nots. It recognizes the two categories of neighbor and stranger without expressing a need to collapse those two categories into one. Um, and that it talks about making ourselves close to other people, making ourselves into neighbors rather than having neighbors. The categories, uh, even though the question is phrased in terms of categories, the response is phrased in terms of attitudes and actions. So that's going to be really important for us. We're going to ask questions about how do we treat another person, and if we can love them equally in their difference as well as in their similarity. Okay, so that's the lesson. Just wanted to remind you, this is that passage from Leviticus that I was mentioning, that in verse 18, Leviticus 9, of chapter 19, you must love your neighbor as yourself. This is where that commandment comes from. But it's important to also note that in this same chapter, the foreigner is also said to be worthy of love as well. Um, but that this is a separate category, that just because they're a stranger doesn't mean that they shouldn't be loved, of course. But verse 34 is not redundant to verse 18. If this was, if the point of this, of the biblical story in both Leviticus and probably also in Luke was to collapse the two categories together, then we would not need to repeat verse 18. Verse 18 would stand on its own. It would just say, love your neighbor as yourself, and it would be interpreted to mean that your neighbor is everyone. But Leviticus 19 distinguishes categories between the guest stranger, the foreigner, and the neighbor, and says that, of course, you're supposed to treat them both with love, but that they are separate categories. And so that's kind of what I wanted to also highlight in the previous story, that stranger and neighbor are separate categories. And that's important for being able to treat people who are differently still with dignity and not expecting that the only reason that we would love them is because they become like us. Um, yeah, um, I think that we can go on now. So in Luke chapter 10, where we are, um, sorry, this is supposed to be verses 1 through 11 and 16 through 20. Um, let's read this. After this, Jesus appointed 72 others and sent them on ahead in pairs to every town and place he intended to visit. He said to them, "The harvest is rich, but the workers are few. Therefore, ask the overseer to send workers to the harvest. Be on your way, and remember, I am sending you as lambs in the midst of wolves. Don't carry a walking stick or knapsack, wear no sandals, and greet no one along the way. And whatever house you enter, first say, 'Peace be upon this house.' If the people live peaceably there, your peace will rest on them. If not, it will come back to you. Stay in that house, eating and drinking what they give you, for the laborer is worth the wage. Don't keep moving from house to house. And whatever city you enter, after they welcome you, eat what they set before you, and heal those who are sick in that town. Say to them, the reign of God has drawn near to you. If the people of any town you enter don't welcome you, go into the streets and say, 'We shake the dust of this town from our feet as testimony against you, but know that the reign of God has drawn near.' Anyone who listens to you listens to me. Anyone who rejects you rejects me, and those who reject me reject the one who sent me." The 72 disciples returned with joy, saying, "Rabbi, even the demons obey us in your name." Jesus replied, "I watched Satan fall from the sky like lightning. Look, I have given you the power to tread on snakes and scorpions, even all the forces of the enemy, and nothing will ever injure you. Nevertheless, don't rejoice in the fact that the spirits obey you so much as the names as your names are inscribed in heaven. So yes, we're skipping a little bit in the middle, but this is the text uh, as it actually is. It's funny that the thing that most of us remember about this is, just like I said, three things that Jesus sends people out, that he tells them not to bring anything, and that you get to be kind of a little bit snide or ranty if you get rejected. I think, and that's probably the part that people most remember, that you get to dust off your sandals if you get rejected, and I think maybe that strikes a very emotional chord with some folks. But let's look at this passage a little bit more carefully. You'll notice that there are several things that are odd here. That if this passage was about those three things, mission, not taking very much, or even, and getting to reject those who reject you, there are several details here that don't make sense. So let's figure out how this passage works. Uh, Color-coded passage to remind us that this section has many similarities with other gospel passages. So, for example, Luke 1 to 12 looks a lot like Matthew chapter 9. It's set in a different context here. In Matthew, it's the sending of the 12 disciples, not the 72. So, what's happening here? So, just you can match the colors to figure out, very similar passages. The point is that, well, let's see what's different between the two of them first. Um, Matthew has a slant in these two explicit underlined sections, that the sending is only to Jewish folks. And this is pretty much unique to Matthew. It doesn't show up in Mark either. Even though there is a parallel section in Mark, and in Mark's version, it is also the sending of the 12 disciples. Uh, and so this is something that we kind of think was an addition that the author of Matthew decided to put in, and it shows the author of Matthew's perspective, that there is an emphasis of a message primarily intended for the Jews. On the other hand, in verse 7, there's a section here that we see eating and drinking what they give you, which could actually be indicating a much more open uh, mindset of who this mission is for, because we know that one of the biggest concerns about expanding the followers of Jesus beyond just Jewish people to Gentiles as well was this concern about whether food laws were being obeyed, whether people could even eat together, whether food that was served to you could be eaten, food that was served by Gentiles to Jews could be eaten by the Jews, because they weren't sure of whether it had been sacrificed according, or it had been prepared according to the strict food laws that were in effect. So this commandment to eat and drink whatever they give you is a pretty radical statement. It says a lot about the acceptance of Gentiles in addition to Jews, and that's much more of Luke's slant. It's a mission to the whole world. Um, so that's something to notice. By the way, I didn't include it here because the text would be too small, but the corresponding section for Mark is in Mark chapter 6. Um, Luke also copies himself. And we're going to see that in just a second as well. But I just want to remind you why we're having this parallel between Luke and Matthew. It's because Luke and Matthew share a common tradition. Well, share two common traditions. They both borrow heavily from Mark. If you look here, well, Matthew, 40%, 6% of Matthew is is made up of Markan material that Matthew probably copied. 41% of Luke is Markan material. And Matthew and Luke share this dark blue section on the bottom, about a quarter each, from some other text that isn't found in Mark, that we call Q. Um, and so it looks as if Matthew and Luke both had the book of Mark and this document Q that they both heavily used from, and then they had some unique sources as well that made Luke and Matthew different. Um, so that's what's happening here. So let's recode that section instead in terms of Mark and Q. What you have here in yellow are the sections in both Luke 10 and Matthew 9 that are taken from Mark. So I just did this by comparing these two to Mark chapter 6. And the red sections are found in both Luke and Matthew, but not found in Mark. And so we think that those are sections that come from the Q document. Um, and that's how we start to know things about how the history of the composition of these things. So it might be interesting for some of you that are still or that are learning about how these documents came to be. The idea that they were written all at one time in one sitting by one author, that was trying to accurately um, document their experience of Jesus and just only their experience just isn't really supported. It's these documents came together from multiple sources over time. But I mentioned that Luke also references Luke. So Matthew and Mark both have a story about the sending of the 12, which looks suspiciously similar to Luke chapter 10, the sending of the 72. Luke actually has both stories. Luke has a sending of the 12 as well as the sending of the 72, and they look like each other as well. We think that this is mostly Markan material. Um, and so what probably happened here is that there were similar stories about the sending in both Mark and Q, and Matthew put those two together and used it to frame the story of the sending of the 12, whereas Luke kept both as separate stories, used the Markan material to for the story of the sending of the 12 disciples, and then used the Q document very heavily to create another story about the sending of the 72. Whether it actually happened or not, we don't know. But we can look at where the sources come from to see that Luke probably then used the Q story for the sending of the 12. Uh, and that's why we have these two very similar sounding stories. The green and the yellow and the red correspond here. And then Luke also references this one more time, but it's not really directly copying, it's a reference. Luke 22, right at the end, before Jesus's crucifixion, during the passage, um, Jesus references this event, the sending of the 72, and says, some of the rules have changed. Like, I'm going to send you out again, and you're not going to have me. But this time you're going to go with provisions. You're going to need a purse. You're going to need a traveling bag. You might even need protection as well. Um, it makes it gives a proper context for what we're going to be talking about today, or what we are talking about today, the Luke chapter 10 passage. It makes it sort of seem like it's a dry run, it's practice, and then this is the real sending. Um, so, this is a small point, but a point worth making that when we want to look for a passage to really kind of inform our understanding of mission, maybe Luke chapter 10 is not the best because it isn't the final sending. Maybe Luke chapter 22 is a better passage to use. Doesn't mean that Luke chapter 10 has no purpose. I think it's really interesting, but perhaps given that we know that even Jesus says some of those rules are no longer in operation, maybe we should look at this one instead. If we wanted to look for a passage, which I don't think we do, but if we wanted to look for a passage to justify sending missionaries out there into the world. Um, and the reason that this happens twice probably is something like when Luke is being written, and we know that Luke is part of a two-volume work called Luke Acts. What's being described in Luke chapter 22 probably reflects the actual action of missionaries in that day, that there were dangers, that they did need to have some money with them, that they did need to take care of their needs, that they couldn't rely on hospitality of their hosts to take care of everything. But Luke is also remembering a time that was probably maybe 80 to 100 years earlier during the life of Jesus when things were different. And so it might be a kind of the story in like Luke chapter 10 um, is sort of has like a nostalgia feeling to it that, there was a time when things were different. And there's a longing for that as well as a reality in Luke 22 of what is currently the situation. Those two things together. Um, so just to note, so this is 10 in its full context. It's in reference to chapter 9, the sending of the 12. It is also itself referenced later on in 22, um, when Jesus prepares his disciples to go on without him, because his passion and resurrection are impending. And it's also referenced as well in Mark and Matthew. So that's the full context. Great. I mentioned that there are some things that are slightly odd about this text. Let's talk about some of them now. And this is probably the meat of the study right here. Let's go on, do this verse by verse. Uh, Things to note in verse number one, God sends missionaries, not churches, and missionaries don't decide to send themselves. It is something that God does. In that continues in verse two as well. Um, Something to note in verse one, this number 70 or 72 is in different texts. The number varies because we have different translations that are either Greek or Hebrew um, that that vary, that don't agree. Um, so, if we think that the Bible is perfect, inerrant, the literally the word of God written by the Holy Spirit, then it's hard to explain why there would be variances such as this. One of them is right and one of them is wrong. Or they're both right, which is the perspective that anyone that really treats this as a text can also tolerate. Uh, but the significance of this is that we think that this is referencing um, the nations that are the descendants of Noah from Genesis chapter 10, which, because of the flood, the Bible at least thinks, or Genesis seems to think, describes the totality of the human race, these 70 or 72 nations. Of course, we know that's not true. Um, and so this could be uh, a way to say that Jesus is sending these missionaries to all of the earth, because it is all the nations that are descended from Noah. Of course, yes, we know that they're being sent in pairs, so it's really only being sent to half the nations of the earth. But that's a detail that we're just going to gloss over. Um, it, I say that perhaps because, very important people like John Calvin disagreed. John Calvin came up with a different explanation. He said that it was either the elders from Exodus 18 or Numbers chapter 11, or it was the Sanhedrin. Um, and he saw this text from Luke through that lens as being uh, an announcement of the reestablishment of the Jewish state because there were only Jewish, uh, or that this was a mission only to the Jews. So, that's a complete 180 from what I just said, that Luke has a perspective that includes Gentiles as well. And so just to say that there's disagreement, I think that we have space to be able to make a decision for ourselves, and it's fine if we don't all agree. Um, but also, we probably shouldn't hang our meaning, our understanding of this entire passage on this one number. This is numerology. Numerology can be interpreted in so many different ways. It informs us, but it doesn't decide things for us. Okay, going on. Um, I know, verse two. What harvest is in mind? It's a metaphor. Um, Harvests are usually metaphors of judgment, though. The when the wheat is separated from the chaff and the chaff is burned, that kind of thing. But here, the harvest is met with joy. Um, the harvest is mission, is the sending of missionaries, and it seems to be part of God's intention. Um, and this is very different. So it takes a common metaphor, and it's already here in verse two, we're seeing that something different is about to happen. And like, pay attention to the word joy. It's going to come up again. And that might be actually really important to understanding this. Verse three, who are the wolves? Um, don't know. Matthew translates this as not lambs, but sheep. I'm sending you as sheep, which, engenders sheep and shepherd imagery. But here it's lambs before wolves, and this is pretty scary. Um, Perhaps, though, it's not. Perhaps it's an eschatological reference to Isaiah, where the wolves lie with the lambs, and lambs are fine with that, and no one eats each other. In which case, um, this story takes a different meaning. That this is saying that in Isaiah that so many of our problems have been resolved, that God is so closely with us that even the wolves and lambs have been able to resolve their differences, and that this whole scenario takes place at a different time, in the end when the world has been brought back to a perfect state, um, which is a cool way to think about this. Probably not the most common way to interpret this, but it's one possible way. Okay, verse 4. Um, Instructions on preparation. How far can you go without a walking stick or knapsack or sandals? Also, not greeting people along the way. That is a really odd instruction, right? You can interpret this in many different ways. You could say that it's about um, uh, the mission being so important that you wouldn't even want to waste your time greeting someone. You could say that this is appealing to the reality that people sometimes get distracted even when they're supposed to do something very important. So, to limit your distractions. Um, I don't know the answer to this, what it means. But I do know that not greeting people along the road, along a journey, is much easier on shorter journeys, and it gets proportionally more difficult on much longer journeys because you're expected at some point to need something or to have to interact with other folks. I think that if there's anything, that the material reality of verse 4 suggests that this was a very limited sending, or sending to people of a very limited area. Um, in terms of how far these people were sent out. Um, okay. Also, one other way to think about this, again, eschatological, is that God's kingdom is so near in time that you won't even have time to need a knapsack or sandals or a walking stick. And I'm going to come back to these possible eschatological interpretations that this is an end time, this is talking about something that happens at the end time, which is a big theme in Luke. Um, the problem with why I don't want to, I'm not uh, ready to jump in with both feet on that is that Luke's gospel is the last to be written in terms of chronology. And it's set after people realized that Jesus wasn't coming within their lifetimes as it had been recorded, and that the original followers of Jesus had started to die off. So the promise that, surely some of you, even before some of you die, I will, come back, just didn't happen. And so Luke is setting us up for how to live beyond that reality, beyond the expectation of Jesus' second coming, how to live with an indefinite period of like future to us. So that this was an eschatological uh, reading, or that this is an eschatological verse talking about that we won't need these things because God is so close, seems to be in conflict with Luke's purpose of actually writing a gospel that will stand the test of time, that isn't dependent on the nearness of God's kingdom in terms of time. Um, okay, so what we know, though, is that these are reminders of the fragility and the dependence on hospitality that missionaries are called to. That's probably the thing that we can say um, that without any controversy. Okay, verse 5. Verses 5 through 13 are largely instructions as what to do and not to do. If we got more specific, in 5 to 7, there are instructions about how do you deal, or what you are to do when you first get to a house. And this is what you're supposed to do first, house first. And then we see after that instructions in 8 to 13 about what you're supposed to do once you've established your base with a household. How are you to interact with the town that surrounds you? So let's get into that. In verses 5 to 7, the disciples are told to act first. Like they make the first move and they give a greeting of peace in order to receive welcome. Um, it's a good reminder that receiving is an important part of mission work, that it's not only about all the things that we have to give to people that we perceive as needing us, but that we are also needy as well, including for sustenance, for food. Um, but it also sets up a pretty logical uh, acknowledgement of reality that you need a home base in a town first. And that's what's being established here. So go up to a house, find a house that welcomes you. Um, and it also says something about the history of our faith, that our first communities were home-based, um, and that therefore then from a person's home, then they were able to interact with the surrounding town and community. It also says that God is revealed around a table by means of humans talking to each other. This is what's recorded here. That our ability to talk about our faith is the thing that is the way that our faith is spread. People come to know of God through us. and through very real things like having a meal together. Pretty cool. Um, but I also want to look at verse 6 more carefully. The term here that's translated as living peaceably is pretty cool in the Greek. Here it says literally if the people are sons of God, or sorry, sons of peace, huios renes. So that is kind of an odd expression. Like, how do you get from sons of peace to peaceable? Um, well, the contrast is here is between a son of peace as opposed to like a parent or a father of peace. Um, the traditional way that people took a religion was that the household followed the religion of the male head of house. Um, so by appealing to a son of peace, Jesus here is turning on its head the idea that you would only have to convert the head of house, the male head of house, and then the rest of the house would follow. Instead, here he's looking for children as being a measure of a household, which is this non-hierarchical way of understanding of this relationship, so that you're not just relying on people to convert out of or to be spoken to or to reach for the message to reach people because they are loyal to the head of house. It's actually dealing with individual people on an individual level and actually going below the head of house and targeting sons, children instead of fathers. Okay, verses 8 to 13 I mentioned are about towns. Um, so unlike the household, so when a missionary is to establish a base of operations with a house, they are to initiate the relationship by giving a greeting of peace. When it comes to towns in verses 8 to 13, that's inverted. The town is expected to make the first move of hospitality before the disciples cure and proclaim the kingdom. And it's also important to note here in this case that curing precedes speaking, that the first thing you're supposed to do is some act of good work, goodwill, some actual like something of value to these people, not just to talk. Um, and here, let's remember that like curing people, healing people, this is going to be very closely related to the dominion over demons that happens in verse 17 because at this point in time, people didn't understand why they got sick. They blamed sickness, mental health issues, lameness. Uh, all of these were actually thought to be the result of demons. Um, and so healing and casting out demons are very closely related to each other at this point. They're essentially the same thing. So um, I think that so this is uh, gives us our instructions, related to the question I had asked earlier about in verse 4, how far could they go to? Because they're now instructed in 7 through 13, don't keep moving from house to house. Um, and whatever city that you enter, uh, stay there. We're also given to question how many towns could have been affected by this. How many towns could have been visited? What was the maximum reach of 72 people in this case? And it wasn't very far is quite the answer. Um, we also think that if they weren't very far in proximity, uh, that they were still close enough to Jesus to be able to be protected by Jesus at this point. That Jesus could have dealt with any problems, or just by his proximity, that these people would have known that they weren't very far from Jesus and could experience that type of solidarity. That was important for why maybe it wasn't as important for them to be concerned about their provisioning or their defense. Okay, sorry. Trying to get to my notes. Um, I think that let's. I wanted to say something about verses 9 and verses 11. Um, Here we have a repeated phrase, the nearness of God. Um, it is independent of the work of the proclaimers, the people who are sent, and it's also independent of the people who are receiving the message. Um, Also, the nearness of the kingdom of God is not self-evident. It needs to be talked about. or it needs to be said. Um, but the nearness itself does not is not dependent on the saying of it. So the kingdom of God is near, regardless of whether we talk about it or not. But people wouldn't know that it was near unless we talked about it. But that doesn't make it more near, the fact that we talk about it. I think that's a really important thing for when we think about our role and our responsibilities in mission work. That, a phrase that I like is that God is already there wherever we go. So the idea that we bring God to other communities, to other people, is completely false. God is already there, regardless of whether we do the work or we don't. But also at the same time, God is not necessarily self-evident. And so the message needs people to be spread, but it is wrong for us to think that we are the ones that bring God to places. That is just us being full of ourselves or just being sloppy with our language. Um, verse 12, uh, for anyone who still has lingering doubts about what the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah was, it wasn't about same-gendered sex. Here in verse 12, uh, just as um, we're told what happened, that Sodom is being invoked as a reference to a lack of hospitality. Um, that is, or it's clarified once again. So it's clear that even for Jesus, the understanding of Sodom's sin was a lack of hospitality, just as these disciples are here concerned about not being received very well. Okay. Um, verses 14 to 15. There is a lament including the condemnation of doubting cities. It seems a little ranty here, noted. Um, but this is interesting because it's a form of lament that is familiar. In fact, this is pretty much a direct quotation of Isaiah 14, verses 13 to 34. But this type of rant against places that God is displeased with in the Hebrew scriptures is reserved solely for rants against foreign nations. And here in this case, Chorazin and Bethsaida, these are Jewish towns. And so this form of lament or oracle against foreign nations is being subverted and being used to proclaim judgment on Jewish cities. Um, and this is pretty much in character with Jesus. Jesus is pretty hard on his own people. Uh, okay, so that's most of what we think of this passage. If you ask people to talk about the sending of the 72, they would say something about those first, I guess, 14 verses. But I actually think that maybe the meat is the second half, starting in verse 17. Um, and it's not about mission at all, really. It's stranger. It's harder for us to picture as opposed to the details of the first 14 verses. Um, but let's look at this. In verse 17, which is original to Luke, um, the success of the mission is measured in exorcisms. Um, and mind you, that demons were thought to be responsible for things like sickness and blindness and mental illness and paralysis. So by commanding the demons, what we're broadly talking about is that human suffering was relieved. That is what these returning missionaries are joyful about, that they were actually successful at making life better for people. Um, so it's not really about demonic possession at all. It is about doing good work. Um, look at also what isn't here. There's no mention of the returning missionaries being very proud or joyful about conversions or good preaching. Um, it is purely about improving living conditions. And this thought is completed in verse 20, um, that winning the fight against the demons shouldn't be a source of joy in the world. Joy comes from the eternal love of God. As much as it's exciting to win battles here on Earth over the powers of evil, and that was true back then, that's true today. When we get a really important equal rights law passed, or when an employer decides to do right by their employees because of community action, when the environment is protected, we get really excited. But the reminder in verse 20 is that that is not our source of joy. Our source of joy is our relationship with God. Um, and that it's our relationship with God that gives us our power over demons. So even if, yes, it's exciting, we're not supposed to enjoy that power. So our relationship with God gives us power over demons. And yes, it does give us joy to exercise power over making the world a better place. To complete that circle, our joy is actually still goes to the source, which is our relationship with God, which gives us the power to be able to do great things in this world. If you think about, if I wanted to look at what's the stronger message in all of this, that's it for me. That there is success, that we measure our success in terms of the way that we improve people's lives around us, actually improve them, not just, make them believe the things that we do. So that's verse 17. And that even though that's a good work, it's still a pointer back to our relationship with God. And that's that our names are inscribed um, in heaven, that God remembers us, that God knows us and is in relationship with us. This is it. This is the important part, I think. Um, some other things to note. Yes, there's a mention of Satan here. This is the only time that Jesus ever has a vision in any of the Gospels. Um, maybe if we make sense of that, I would say something like, uh, reminding us that even if Satan has fallen from the sky, that doesn't mean that Satan is defeated yet. Uh, let's kind of put this in terms of a diagram. If Satan falls out of heaven, that means that Satan is here on earth and has power here on earth. Um, and Jesus's vision here, both prophetic and apocalyptic, kind of sets the stage for why then the 72 are sent out, because Satan is and the demons are active here on earth. Um, and maybe this is eschatological again. Maybe this is a vision that is only fulfilled in the end times, but very real in this present. The rejoicing of these disciples is that there is still victory that has been already foreseen. That we are victorious. That we do have power over forces of evil here on earth. So it's a both and, or a already and not yet, that no, the defeat of Satan is not complete. But knowing that Satan has already been defeated and cast down from heaven, knowing that we already have power over Satan here on earth, these are the important things. And it gives us confidence. So at the end of the day, I think we can look at this passage and ask ourselves a question here. We've been told that this is about mission, but is mission here, as it's portrayed here, uh, is the purpose of that conversion? Or is this a story about victory over the forces of evil? Is this a story about Jesus' power to fight against injustice through the evangelists, through us, his followers, with the guarantee that God has already done the first half, the casting out of Satan from heaven, and that God has already guaranteed the success of our work, even if it means that there's still much for us to do as well. So we can't just lay back or sit back, but at the same time, we do this hard work knowing that it will be successful. Perhaps it's because this victory is already assured. That's why it shouldn't be the source of our joy, because it's like knowing the end of a story or like knowing who wins a game before you watch it. We know who's going to win, but it's the game itself, the enjoyment of seeing that action unfold. Um, that's our relationship with God, and that's the source of our joy. Um, and that's not easy, right? That's a struggle. Um, but maybe that's what we're called to do. So I just want to give you a map. The three cities that were in magenta, um, that we have record of people being sent to, they're really close to each other, maybe within 4 miles of each other. So the question about how far did they go? Not very far is likely, and that makes sense if they weren't really taking very much with them. Maybe like a 2 hour walk, something like that. Um, but notice that people that are this close to each other would have been serving in villages that were under the same political rulership, that had the same language, that had a similar culture, that had the same prevailing religion. So this isn't a mission in chapter 10 of people being sent to the far edges of the world or being sent to cultures that are very different from them. I also want to point out, just that for comparison, one of the reasons maybe we don't want to use chapter 10 as a reason to or as a model for missionary work is that it is really different than the way that mission has worked in this world in our history. People have not gone with very few provisions, and they have not gone, um, or they have not come back with very little as well. The history of the missionaries in Hawaii is pretty problematic. Um, we do a great disservice when we tell ourselves lies like, oh, the missionaries uh, to Hawaii did well. It was their sons who were the problem children, or who were the troublemakers. And yes, many sons of missionaries were involved in the committee that overthrew the monarchy and were very, very much focused on their own self-interest. But the missionaries to Hawaii also are not innocent of that as well. The story about how land becomes privately owned in Hawaii is instigated by missionaries. The Great Mahele in 1840, the law that first granted the idea of private ownership of property was advised by missionaries. Um, the thing to know is that in the end, it wasn't really very successful because it was a foreign cultural idea to own property. And so out of, I think we had about 86,000 people, Native Hawaiians at that point in time. Only 18,000 of them actually ever did anything to try to claim land. And of the total available land, only about 1% of it was ever claimed through the provisions of the Great Mahele, which meant that a lot of land was left unclaimed, which became prime areas for missionaries to to grab. So much so that as the uh, foreign commissioners to Hawaii wrapped up the mission to Hawaii and kind of cut loose the missionaries and said, "You're on your own. You got to fend for yourselves." The missionaries demanded from the crown a 560-acre per missionary compensation package. So contrast, the Great Mahele had given 3 acres to citizens or to Native Hawaiians. Missionaries demanded from the crown as just compensation for the good work that they had been doing here, 560 acres each. And you have names like Asa Thurston, Hiram Bingham, um, but also names like Castle and Cook, who receive these large allocations that become the nuclei for things like the Haiku Sugar Plantation, which becomes Alexander and Baldwin, for Castle and Cook, the Big Five that dominate the Hawaiian economy for a century. Um, these are missionary endeavors. Elias Bond, the Kohala Sugar Plantation, becomes known as the Missionary Sugar Plantation. And this is all kind of hand in hand with the commissioning of the first missionaries, Asa Thurston and Hiram Bingham, who were commissioned at an ordination service, the text of which was Joshua chapter 13, verse 1. There yet remaineth much more land to be possessed. The phrase that is used, I think it's eerily accurate, is that missionaries came to do good, but they stayed to do well. We're not saying that missions work is good or bad, or that missionaries are themselves good or bad. Um, they have done good, no doubt, but they've also done a lot of harm. And it's important for us to remember that when the focus becomes on securing material possessions, then that can go too far very easily, especially in cultures that are very different, that are very vulnerable. And so, even though we are more aware of these things now, we're much more thoughtful. I'm not sure that we're really able to protect ourselves, or if this is not, or the, I suspect this continues to be a perennial concern. So, I mean, just to remind you, um, the contrast between what happened here in Hawaii and the instructions here. Of course, we remember Luke chapter 22, in which people are instructed to bring a purse with them, but that doesn't mean that they need to fill it. So let's look at a different perspective. This is a picture of Ivan Illich. He was one of my heroes. Delivered a really famous address to American missionary hopefuls in 1967 called Yankee Go Home. Um, Ivan was speaking from the perspective of Mexico. He was living in Cuernavaca and running a training center for potential missionaries to Latin America. But that it was advertised as a language center, but in reality, it was really subversive and was its main mission was to convince potential missionaries to leave the mission field and go back home. Um, And we have to think, okay, so let's maybe admit that it's sort of problematic to go into the mission field with the idea of conversion, right? Because it ignores the goodness of the stranger, of people who are different. It fails to recognize that their indigenous religions are meaningful and sufficient um, and develop deep community and answer some really important questions. It fails to see that possibility in people who are very different. But there are also still missionaries that go out into the world with the hope of doing good. Um, and that's fine, legitimate, fine. Maybe that's even the point of what the Luke chapter 10 passage is suggesting. Here's the thing, though. Ivan had a different perspective. He said that even if that's your perspective, if that's your intention, that you want to do good, you might end up doing more bad than good. Um, and that's because we cannot help while spreading the gospel, while spreading our ideas of what is normal or what is the direction of development, we can't help but also spreading our culture and the assumptions about our own upbringing as Americans, as probably middle class Americans, of what a good life looks like. And that's not necessarily even an option for much of the world, nor is it necessarily good or life-giving for the rest of the world as well. You do have to wonder whether the American lifestyle really is even that positive. So, you know, Latin America in particular, it's problematic because many of the problems in Latin America, environmental degradation, vast rich-poor gaps, resource exploitation, uh, those problems are actually caused by the United States. Um, we do this directly uh, by our uh, unequal trade practices, by the American multinational corporations that exploit other countries. Um, and also by our government interventions. The United States has such a horrible history, whether it be 1961 in the Dominican Republic, 1964 in Brazil, 1971 in Bolivia, 1973 in Chile, toppling these populist, democratic, oftentimes protectors of their countries just because they might possibly stand up against the United States' interests or the interests of American companies that operated in Latin America that were exploiting these countries. Um, and we've replaced these governments always with very, very repressive, dictatorial governments that have abused their citizens. So, we have to think to what extent if we are sending people out into the world to do good, maybe we should try to solve the problems that we're causing here um, before we even go out. And also, of course, cultural contamination as well. To what extent are we spreading ideas about what it means to live a good life that are just simply unattainable or unsustainable is maybe a better word. Um, I can't help but wonder if one of maybe the main reasons that people who are really out there just to do good, to improve water supplies, to spread healthcare, why they do this in a foreign context, I can't help but ask if it's because it's easier to do that work very far away than asking what we need to do here at home to stop the harm that we're causing in places far away. It's somehow that's a question about our own complicity. What are we complicit with? What harm have we caused, as opposed to just putting band-aids on around the world? Um, and maybe that's work that's a little bit more challenging for us. So I just want to read a few words from Ivan, just to give us a sense of what he means by the dangers that we pose to the rest of the world. Um, so he writes here, I'm here to tell you, if possible, to convince you and hopefully to stop you from pretentiously imposing yourselves on Mexicans. I do have deep faith in the enormous goodwill of the United States volunteer. However, his good faith can usually be explained only by an abysmal lack of intuitive delicacy. By definition, you cannot help being a vacationing salesman for the middle-class American way of life, since that is the only life you know. A group like this could not have developed unless a mood in the United States had supported it, the belief that any true American must share God's blessings with his poorer fellow men. The idea that every American has something to give and at all times may, can, and should give it. explains why it occurred to students that they could help Mexican peasants develop by spending a summer with them. It is now high time to cure yourselves of this illusion. Like the values you carry, you are products of an American society of achievers, consumers, and a two-party system, universal schooling, and family car affluency. You are ultimately, consciously or unconsciously, salesmen for a delusive belief in the ideals of democracy, equal opportunity, and free enterprise among people who haven't the remotest possibility of profiting from these. You start on the task without any training. Even the Peace Corps spends about $10,000 on each corpsman to help him adapt to his new environment and guard him against the culture shock. How odd that nobody ever thought about spending the money to educate poor Mexicans in order to prevent them from the culture shock of meeting you. And, pause here. I read a book called Toxic Charity that just asked, when we send kids on a mission, a summer mission to go and paint a schoolhouse in another country, why don't we just use that money instead and give it to that other country so that they could invest in their own labor force? Like, how many jobs were taken away from people that are already there that could have done the exact same work? And how much farther could that money have gone if it wasn't paying for airplane trips and housing? Um, how much more effective could it have been if it had just gone directly into the economy to do the same work? So, to what extent, and this is my question here, is the reason that we're willing to spend this money is because we're spending the money to make ourselves feel better, not necessarily to actually do good work in the other country. Because if we really cared about that first, then we wouldn't go ourselves. We'd find someone there to do the work. Get back to this. So Illich says, in fact, you cannot even meet the majority which you pretend to serve in Latin America, even if you could speak their language, which most of you cannot. You can only dialogue with those like you, Latin American imitations of the North American middle class. There's no way for you to really meet the underprivileged since there's no common ground whatsoever on which to meet. If you have any sense of responsibility at all, stay with your riots here at home. Work for the coming elections. McCarthy might lose, but certainly by campaigning for him, you will know what you are doing, why you're doing it, and how to communicate with those to whom you speak. And you will know when you fail. If you insist on working with the poor, if this is your vocation, then at least work among the poor who can tell you to go to hell. It is incredibly unfair for you to impose yourselves on a village where you are so linguistically deaf and dumb that you don't even understand what you're doing or what people think of you. And it is profoundly damaging to yourselves when you define something that you want to do as good, a sacrifice, and help. I'm here to suggest that you voluntarily renounce exercising the power which being an American gives you. I'm here to entreat you to freely, consciously, and humbly give up the legal right you have to impose your benevolence on Mexico. I am here to challenge you to recognize your inability, your powerlessness, and your incapacity to do the good which you intended to do. I am here to entreat you to use your money, your status, and your education to travel in Latin America. Come to look, come to climb our mountains and enjoy our flowers, come to study, but do not come to help. That is a voice from a receiving country. And I think we should take it pretty seriously because we are so wrapped up in the good that we want to do and what we want, but we never stop to ask whether they really want us. That's equally, if not more important, right? So just a quick thought experiment. Um, this idea of spreading American culture um, inadvertently. Let's take the idea of nutrition. Um, we've got great nutrition here in this country. We waste uh, 30 to 40% of our food supply. Just it never even makes it onto a person's plate. We also have incredible poverty and malnutrition as well. This is true. But let's look at the American diet. If we were to say, like, we want the rest of the world to have what we have, which is a common thing that do-gooders say. We're so convinced of the rightness of our own lifestyle and how exemplary we are, and we just wish that the rest of the world could behave as us. Let's take meat consumption as an example. Knowing how meat is produced, knowing what the average American meat consumption is, for the world to eat meat to the same degree that Americans do, we'd require 5.32 billion acres of arable land. Okay, here's the problem. There are only 3.41 billion acres of arable land in the world. And if we used all of that land, somehow we found another 1.9 billion acres, I don't know, somewhere, and produced enough meat so that everyone could eat as much meat as American does, we'd still all be starving because meat only makes up 20% of the calories of the American diet. We'd still need more land on top of that to grow the vegetables that we would also need to eat as well, and the grain that we'd also need to eat as well. The point is that there simply isn't enough land on the face of planet Earth for everyone to eat like an American. On top of that, of course, since 1961, we've lost a third of our arable land because of climate change that is largely driven by a North American lifestyle of overconsumption. The point is that it's simply impossible for the world to behave as we do. So if we want to do good in this world, of course, the mission mindset is that we spread out and do good things in other countries. What if we want to do good in this world, the answer actually is that we need to change our lifestyle here because we already overconsume. And just by being American, even if we didn't send a missionary at all, we are still creating harm in the world. Just by living as we do, because we overconsume and our greed, our access to resources, blinds us to the question about whether it's good for us to consume these resources just because we have access to them. So maybe the work is actually a lot closer to home, just as Ivan Illich was saying. Maybe this is the context in which we do good for the world. We change our political systems so that we don't exploit other countries. We even change our own lifestyle so that we live in a way that's globally sustainable. Maybe this is what mission work actually is. Maybe this is what it is to conquer demons. Last slide here. I want to bring up, I guess it seems appropriate here, to bring up an idea that might be the first response, but probably isn't a really great response. This is anonymous Christianity, first written about by Karl Rahner, a great theologian. I love a lot of what he wrote. It was a 20th century attempt to grapple with the fact that, there's a lot of the world either that was separated from Jesus and Christianity in time, that, all the humans that lived before Jesus, or that just were never reached by Christian missionaries because they were so far away. Um, do they all go to hell? What happens to that? Um, Ronner came up with an idea called anonymous Christianity that was controversial, still is. It was part of a movement called inclusivism. And it said that people can unknowingly respond to God's grace even through other religious traditions by sincerely seeking truth and goodness. And if they strive to live according to moral codes that happen to be very Christian in similarity, uh, then they get the gift of grace of Jesus's grace that includes the forgiveness of sins and salvation and eternal life. And there are some places in the text that can support this. Romans chapter 2 states that says that Gentiles who do not have the law can still behave as if they are following the law simply by following their conscience. And if their conscience happens to align with what happens to be in the law, like if they just happen to believe similar things, even if they don't know why they believe similar things, then they also get the same benefits of eternal life. Matthew chapter 25 says that people who are destined for eternal life are judged based on their actions, whether they were kind, whether they took care of the needy. They're not judged by what they believed or what they confessed, but instead how they treated other people. That is the qualification for eternal life. So there is some support for this. Of course, there is criticism um, that from conservatives, for example, there are quite a few passages that claim that only knowledge of Jesus, only belief in Jesus, uh, is the way to eternal life. The Bible doesn't speak with one voice on every issue or on really any issue. Um, and there are liberal critiques for this as well, uh, that this is simply um, really, really paternalistic or condescending. Um, yes, there are examples of loving, moral people and religious traditions that give spiritual meaning to people's lives all over the world. Um, very, very deep spiritual and religious traditions that foster loving relationships, that give great answers to the common questions that religion is asked of, or is asked of religion. Um, but telling a devout Muslim that they're actually a Christian, whether or not they believe it, is really presumptuous. It's sort of offensive, in fact, because it says that other people's beliefs are valued only to the extent to which they correspond to Christian beliefs. Um, so, so this attempt Rahner was trying to make to say that awareness of and adherence to Christian doctrine is not the only path to eternal life, that people can live a life that's moral and relatively indistinguishable from being a Christian because of its effects. That's what matters, not its beliefs, which could be different. But people could achieve a similar morality and therefore still essentially functionally be a Christian. Um, I don't think that actually solves the problem here. And this is not the reason that we should, I mean, we could excuse, um, this is not the solution to the problem of mission work. Because at the end of the day, the problem underlying this belief even is that we still haven't figured out why some Christians are threatened by diversity in religious beliefs. And I think that's actually what we're setting out to ask ourselves. What is the base insecurity that insists that Christianity has a monopoly on moral truth? Yes, of course, there are biblical passages that essentially say that. Um, but just because there are biblical passages that say that doesn't mean that it's good theology and it doesn't mean that it's true. And it doesn't mean that it even reflects the evidence that we have in front of us, especially as the interconnections in our world give us so much greater access to people that are legitimately happy and moral and spiritual and not Christian. Um, what do we do with that? If we truly can respect the religious traditions of others, just as I think the Good Samaritan story asks us to, if we can see that the neighbor could be very different than me and that they're able to do good, even if they come from a different faith system, if we regard that with curiosity and wonder, would we see that there is even a need for mission at all that seeks conversion as its end goal? And if we take conversion out of the goal of mission, if it really is just reducible to casting out demons and ridding the world of evils, diseases, of both the body form and diseases of the soul, like greed and inequality and imperialism, how is mission work any different from the good things that many NGOs do with respect to education or healthcare, nutrition? And is that what we should be doing instead? So, is there a unique call to Christian mission, or is there just doing good? And where do we focus our attention? Do we focus it in ways that affect the world where the action is local? Or do we really need to go adventuring around the world to be able to do good? Is that a band-aid, or is this systemic work more likely to be targeted where the problem originates, which is oftentimes here, locally in America? Um, I think these are some of the questions that we need to be actually asking when we look at a passage like Luke 10. Um, and that's what I'll leave you with, some good questions. Thanks.